Setting boundaries is self-caring. They're protective. They're not punitive. They protect us and they help us meet our needs and allow us to take care of our emotional, physical, all the needs that we have.
From To Be Magnetic, this is the Expanded Podcast with your host, Lacey Phillips.
And your host, Jessica Gill.
As the leading destination for neural manifestation, we dispel the woo-woo in order to help you create real, tangible results based on neuroplasticity, psychology, epigenetics, and energetics. Our goal is to normalize the practice of manifestation and empower you to get into the driver's seat of your life in order to manifest the experiences, relationships, and things that most align with your authenticity. And by pressing play, the process begins.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Expanded. Jessica here. Today, we are covering a very highly requested topic, dealing with the narcissist in your life. Now, narcissism is a big buzzword. A lot of people are utilizing it, pointing fingers, or maybe just starting to wake up and realize that they may have someone who is on the narcissistic spectrum in their life, and because of that are having some difficulties in their own emotional well-being. We've had so many members write in that they have had a narcissist in their life and they are recovering to rebuild their self-worth, independence, their authenticity, to discover who they truly are. And when we are working on overriding those old limiting beliefs, when we have a parental figure or someone close to us growing up who is on the narcissistic spectrum, it can be really challenging to define who you are now and feel safe to even put your needs first. So today we have on narcissistic abuse expert and therapist, Hannah. Hannah and I are going to dive into what does it mean to actually be clinically diagnosed as a narcissist? What are the specific traits that surround that? And we're also going to dive into whether you have been in relation with a narcissist in your life or not. If you struggle with codependency, people pleasing, defining your sense of self, feeling good enough, a lot of things that we can struggle with just from societal upbringing. These are some incredible tools on how to rebuild your sense of self. Even if you have just a challenging personality in your life where you find it really difficult to be yourself around them, set boundaries, advocate for your needs, not get baited into a tricky conflict situation, this episode is going to be such an incredible resource. And we give some tips and tools within the TBM work. So if you are someone who is recovering from narcissistic abuse, we will give you our best DIs to utilize for that as well. I hope this is a big sense of validation, feeling seen and heard in all of your experiences here, because I know this dynamic can be very tricky and very painful, but please have faith and know that you are so capable of having your beautiful, healed, worthy, magnetic life, regardless of any challenging dynamics you have around this topic. And as always, we highly recommend working with a licensed mental health professional or therapist in your area if you're really struggling in recovery on this topic. Okay, sending you all love and enjoy this episode.
And now, a word from our partners.
If you have not heard of Arma colostrum, let me tell you why it has quickly become my absolute favorite superfood that I've been taking on a daily basis. Arma is an unrivaled nutrient powerhouse. It has 400 plus pure bioactives that are natural molecules that promote healthy function throughout the body. They include a host of protective antibodies, prebiotic compounds, strengthening peptides, amino acids, trace minerals, immunoglobulins, tissue growth factors, antioxidants, and other natural immune factors that work synergistically to enhance your health. This superfood is actually the first piece of nutrients that we receive, that all mammals receive from their mothers within 48 to 72 hours after giving birth. It is that nutrient-dense supplement to really help our bodies thrive, function, and grow to the best of our abilities. There are 5,000 plus studies on this stuff that really show at any age, taking and ingesting colostrum can help our bodies function on the highest level. Now, I started taking this over the summer and pretty much noticed results immediately. Bloating went down, digestion got better, and my immunity seemed to be a lot stronger. I would come across people with colds or sicknesses thinking I'd be coming down with it in a few days, and it seemed to have really supported my innate immune system. It is completely sustainably sourced from a family-owned dairy farm. They only use the surplus of colostrum, and they're able to remove any unnecessary compounds from the colostrum, like casein and fat, which is part of the reason that some dairy can be inflammatory to some people. I'm someone that's very sensitive to dairy, and anytime I have real dairy, I always wind up taking a lactate. But using colostrum, I've never had any issue with it at all. And in fact, it seems to protect me just as well as the dairy pill against some of the dairy that I eat. And part of the reason that that is happening and why I feel like it's been so effective is because it's helping to rebuild your barriers. We talk about having a really strong barrier protection in the lining of our mouth, our sinuses, our lungs, our gut. Our barriers house 80% of our immune system. It's the first line of defense against everything that we inhale and ingest from the outside world. So when you take Armra close to eating, inflammatory foods or being in an atmosphere where the air quality isn't as optimal, your barriers are tightening to help protect you from everything else going on. So this is one of my absolute favorite superfood products out there on the market. I think it is fantastic. I really see results from it. Feel free to ask me questions if you're curious about it. And we have a discount code for you guys. You can use the code TBM for 15% your first order. Again, that is code TBM for 15% off. And if you're interested, you can get the subscription. That way you won't ever run out and you can always have that immune support.
All right, on to the episode.
This is the topic I've been wanting to have on Expanded for so long. So many of you in the community have written in that there is a narcissist in your life, that you have dealt with a narcissist in your family, in your relationships, in your friend group, and it can be a really challenging interaction to say the least. And especially if you had a parent who this sort of behavior fell into, there's a lot of wounding and limiting beliefs that can come to the surface, especially in your recovery with this. So today we have narcissism expert Hannah on, who's going to kind of walk us through. We kismetly found your Instagram and we're like, she is speaking about this topic in such a holistic, healing way that we were like, we have to have you on. And you followed the TBM account. We're like, this is meant to be. This is it.
It was like so perfect. And I feel like, I think I mentioned this to you, Jessica. I feel like TBM is also such a great resource for folks who are recovering from narcissistic abuse in terms of reprogramming those limiting beliefs that they took in, especially if the narcissist was a parent. And so it's like such a perfect union. I feel like I'm not sponsored to say this, but like I love TBM for that reason alone. It's just so powerful.
Oh, so cool. Okay, so let's kick off a little bit of background on you. So do you happen to know your sun, moon, and rising sign?
I do. I am a Gemini sun, Virgo moon, and Aquarius rising.
I can totally see that, especially with your energy. You have that Aquarian, like floaty, very spiritual, creative. I love it. And maybe especially in relation to this topic, but what is your cultural background and upbringing, and how did that inform who you are today and the work that you do today?
So I am white female. I grew up in an army situation. My dad was in the military, so I was moving like every 3 years, always relocating. And, I got to kind of see the impact of trauma. My dad has PTSD, and I got to really kind of witness the impact that had on me and the family. And I feel like that kind of just tuned me into being a lot more, to sometimes a fault, empathetic and very aware of like what's happening in other people's emotional states around me. It kind of unintentionally set me up to do this work. I honestly never thought of myself as like going into the world of therapy. I thought I was going to do like PR and communications and like work in media, but that just wasn't my calling. And I think when I was about, I must have been like 28 when I sort of entered into this world of therapy, and probably to some extent traveling around the world and being exposed to different cultures really kind of normalized different backgrounds and allowed me to just get another glimpse of what happens in the world and the people that inhabit it and different cultures. And I feel like that has really informed how I work with people.
Okay, so the question that a lot of people are wondering, it was so interesting because when we polled like some of our community and some of our team and we're asking questions, I was like, okay, what questions do you have for her? And it was very clear what people know that they interact with a narcissist and what people were like, I don't understand what narcissism is. So one of the questions was really around how to know what constitute as a narcissist. It's such a buzzword right now. You know, anyone that has any sort of behavior that is toxic in any form gets this label. There's, I think, a big difference in a spectrum too of like, we all kind of have somewhat of narcissistic qualities to a certain extent, but what sets apart those quote selfish behaviors from someone that may be clinically diagnosed on that spectrum?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And you're totally right. It's very buzzwordy. You know, if people have a tendency to label someone as a narcissist if they just don't like them. But I mean, really, narcissism is a personality disorder. So it's characterized by, you have to have like 5 out of the 9 traits. The difference between like healthy narcissism and pathological narcissism, those of us with like the healthy narcissism, you know, we have a level of self-confidence, agency, we want to meet our goals. That's all very healthy. But a narcissist is going to use other people to meet their own needs. So essentially, these are people who are very highly dysregulated, very sensitive to perceived criticism, shame prone, and they need other people to put all of those vulnerable feelings onto. They have a way of projecting their vulnerabilities onto other people so that they don't have to deal with it. So when you're dealing with a narcissist, you're really dealing with someone who is using you as a tool to sustain their own self-esteem, to ward off uncomfortable feelings, and essentially to just get their needs met at whatever means possible, essentially.
One of the things you shared that I feel like really got to the root of it too is that they have a really hard time, if not impossible time, understanding that their sense of self is not the center, that you can be over there, have your life, your sense of self, and that doesn't impact them. And so if they fall into this category, you doing something good can negatively impact them because it's like a zero-sum game. If you win, then I lose, and that doesn't make me feel good. So they have a really hard time allowing others to win or feeling rejected or shameful or not good enough. And it all relates, like you're saying, to that other person.
Yes, 100%. They do not want other people to be, quote, more special than they are. They have a really hard time regulating through feelings of envy. And so, yeah, if someone outside of them is successful, for instance, they can read that as this person's success is dimming mine. They don't really have a sense of themselves as being separate. I mean, everyone is like an extension of themselves, right? And so if someone else is, quote, doing better than they are, that can feel like an attack, right? It can feel like, oh, this person now is better than I am, or now thinks that they're better than I am, and I need to essentially put them in their place. And so, yeah, there is really no sense of like an authentic sense of self. All of it is a false sense of self. And so they look at other people as either I think I was saying this, they look at people as tools. And they can also look at other people as threats, a threat to their own standing, social standing, identity, all of those characteristics.
What kicks off that narcissistic behavior, that a narcissistic organization in their brain? Because a lot of people think, okay, well, I have this narcissist in my life and it's challenging, but maybe they'll go to therapy or maybe they'll change or maybe they'll do this. And there's this kind of false hope, or they have glimmers where they don't exhibit any negative behavior. And you're like, wait a second, this is a great experience. Things are going really well. Maybe I was wrong. How can we kind of distill down for people like this is something that happens in their brain wiring?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like there's a few components with how it develops. I mean, on the one hand, there are some genetic components that might contribute to narcissistic traits, but it doesn't just sort of exist in a vacuum, you know? It is something that is formed through many, many different levels. It could be traumatic attachments, traumatic upbringings. It can be cultural components. There can be different, like even gender, how we sort of, you know, boys are sort of raised in a very particular way versus girls. It is being impacted by a lot of factors. So trauma can absolutely be a component to the development of narcissism. You know, narcissism is a set of defense mechanisms at the end of the day. So it's a way of protecting a very fragile ego from being destroyed. And so if you've had trauma, like neglecting parents, abusive parents, that can be one way of protecting the ego, is to start developing this sort of grandiosity and feelings of contempt towards others. So it could be thought of as like a protective mechanism. And there's also some evidence that shows that parents who are too deferential to their children, who kind of just like default to whatever the children want, can start to show up as grandiose presentations of narcissism. I sort of think of like the Dursleys and Harry Potter, how they treated Dudley as just like this little king who could do no wrong. And he was such a very entitled, kind of bratty person. But narcissism is something that develops through a lot of different layers. So it's not necessarily one thing, like trauma causes this, but it's like trauma and family structures. If you have a super enmeshed family or a super distant family, all of these things can come together to cultivate a narcissistic personality.
And do you think your theory on can they change? Can they evolve? Can they grow? Can that disorder shift?
The answer largely is no. But I always kind of add a caveat. Since narcissism runs on a spectrum, if someone is lower down on the spectrum and they do have a desire to make some changes in their life, probably the best we can hope for is behavior change. Not so much personality change, that's going to be pretty congruent throughout the lifespan, but it is possible for a narcissistic person to learn new behaviors, to learn how to regulate their emotions, to learn how to develop some self-acceptance. But that is a pretty rare experience. I would say for the most part, because narcissists are so defended, they don't really see themselves as being the problem. They see other people as being the problem. So what ends up leading them to therapy is not usually their own intrinsic desire to change. It could be like, I lost my job, or my partner and I don't get along, or, I mean, it can be more externally based rather than like, ooh, I really want to focus on like how I can build real self-acceptance. That's usually not the driving force. But I always like to say that yes, there can be some behavioral change, but to not get anyone's hopes up, usually the answer is no.
What would be some signs that someone may have narcissistic abuse that they're dealing with, or if someone had no idea if someone maybe they thought they just had a challenging dynamic growing up, right? But they don't necessarily know if they have a narcissist in that dynamic. What would be some signs that they may be struggling with that abuse now as an adult?
I feel like the thing that I see the most is, I'll just kind of list out a few symptoms that I see kind of just right off the bat, which is like a person may be experiencing a great degree of shame, this sense of like, there's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. I'm never going to measure up. self-blame, a lot of anxiety of just kind of being on edge, perhaps even like having an insecure attachment style where there's a lot of insecurity, a lot of fear of the other person abandoning them. I think what I see the most really is two pieces. One is a real fear of their own emotions, especially feelings towards other people. There's this kind of rationalizing like, well, I shouldn't be angry at others because maybe they had a hard life, or who am I to, da. Then there's also a lot of minimizing of your own needs. So feeling like your needs really aren't that important, or they can come way last. At the core, it's like a loss of a sense of self. Feeling like there's something bad about you. There's a lot of guilt. So narcissists, they don't have a good sense of their own self-esteem or their own sense of self. And they end up transferring that onto like their children, for instance, who then grow up internalizing all of the stuff that the narcissist did not want to face inside of themselves. So sometimes folks can kind of feel like, well, I don't know if my mom or my dad is really a narcissist, so how can I really tell? But if you come back to these questions of what's your relationship to yourself? Do you validate your feelings? Do you meet your needs? Are you okay with setting boundaries? And if the answer is largely like, no, I don't know how to do that, or that's too scary, or I can't, to me, that usually indicates, okay, that's likely because you were instructed essentially or conditioned not to do any of that. And folks who've been impacted by narcissistic abuse are really good at meeting the needs of other people, almost like hyper responsible for other people and meeting their needs, validating their feelings, but they just don't do that to themselves.
Yeah, you had one post about people pleasing, codependency, and being an empath, how these really could be signs that you have been impacted by narcissistic abuse or personality disorder. How does that function? What are some of the ways that people pleasing may have helped them in their upbringing that now they're translating into the world?
100%. I think you nailed it on the head, because it was a self-protective strategy. It was a way to maintain a relationship. It's sort of like if you're familiar with the nervous system response of fawning. It's that sense of the other person, the narcissistic parent, does not feel safe. They feel dysregulated, and that's scaring me. And so the people pleasing becomes a survival strategy of, let me take care of you so that those big scary emotions that you're exhibiting go away. I start to feel safe again. It started out in a way that was adaptive for the environment. And I think when adult children of narcissists grow up, the people-pleasing starts to become more of a deterrent than anything else. It really doesn't have as much of a function as it once did when they were kids. People-pleasing becomes more of a symptom in the end. And it can be a real driver for anxiety. It can create this feeling of, I'm not okay until that person over there is okay. That codependency piece sort of kicks in there. It's a loss of self, and it's a overly giving a lot of the attention and energy to the other person in order to regulate them, thus making yourself feel more regulated in the end. So it's kind of like an externalizing way of building self-regulation.
One other thing I want to touch on before going into like, okay, now what do we do, is I had a friend who was in a relationship with someone who was on the narcissistic spectrum, and I believe that person was covert. And so it was really hard to tell, because when they were in public, they were very generous and kind and exuberant, and everyone loved being around them, and it was great. But then they would get in arguments behind the scenes, and the way in which they would argue, even just being a friend on the side, I was like, that sounds like some of those coping behaviors. First of all, what is covert narcissism versus overt narcissism? And also, what are some of those basically defenses that they lean on when they feel that intense shame come up, or that lowered sense of self? Like, what are some behaviors they might revert to when they're feeling so threatened?
Yes. Well, you're spot on. The example you gave of someone being publicly facing, very charismatic, charming, gregarious, and then behind closed doors being a lot more malicious and unkind and devaluing. A vulnerable or covert narcissist is someone who presents as highly reactive, hypersensitive to perceived slights or criticisms, and they're more prone toward acting like the victim and using guilt to manipulate other people into meeting their needs. And what's an interesting thing is that covert narcissists at their core actually do kind of have a grandiose sense of self. They believe that they are special. And sometimes the way that manifests is like, I'm the most special by how much I am suffering. They have a way of playing on people's sympathies to get the admiration and validation that they're craving. So what's interesting is covert narcissists, I think, are a lot more common than the more grandiose overt type. In fact, I would say most of the people I work with have a covert narcissist in their life. And I think these are folks that are harder to spot because they can present like, I'm just having a hard day, or I don't know if I'm good enough. I mean, it can look very not narcissistic at first blush. It just doesn't present that way, versus the overt narcissist is someone that, we've seen in movies, very entitled, kind of aggressive, extroverted. There's a lot of like what feels like confidence emanating from them. And very much I am better than everyone else. And, they'll boast about things that they literally have no skills in, but they'll just use that as a way to inflate their ego and inflate their sense of self. And so the question about what are the coping strategies they use when they're slighted, it'll maybe look different depending on the phenotype. So a grandiose narcissist might resort more toward rage, contempt, devaluing another person, bolstering themselves up, maybe even being like, well, you're not important enough to me for me to even be mad at you. You're nothing to me. There's kind of more of that style. Whereas a covert narcissist is really going to use a lot of guilt tripping, passive aggressiveness, manipulation, and ultimately prey on another person's sympathy to get their needs met. So it's just going to look a little different, but at the core, all of them need other people to validate, admire, and sort of prop them up in a certain light so that their self-esteem stays intact and they don't essentially collapse.
You've likely heard the benefits of getting your omega-3s in and your fatty acids, but a new study has come out about the first new nutritional deficiency in 75 years. It's called cellular fragility syndrome, and it's caused by a lack of an essential fatty acid that we didn't even know about. It's called C15. Many as 1 in 3 people worldwide have low levels of C15 and thus cellular fragility syndrome. Without this essential fatty acid, it creates age-related breakdown. The cells are not as strong, they start to break down sooner, it can impair metabolic, liver, and heart health. And that brings me to our latest partner on the podcast, Fatty 15. Fatty 15 has 3 times more cellular benefits than omega-3 or fish oil. It's patented pure, oxidation-resistant C15 powder formula derived from plants and vegan-friendly. Free of flavors, filler, allergen, or preservative. The only ingredient is C15, so it's 100% pure. Now, if you're someone who cares about or thinks about the idea of longevity, this part is going to be really fascinating. So Fatty 15 was co-founded by Dr. Stephanie Van Watson. She was working with the U.S. Navy to continually improve the health and welfare of aging dolphins. And one of the studies that they ran is they noticed certain types of dolphins were living significantly longer lives than other dolphins. And they wanted to understand why. Why were they having better health conditions, less Alzheimer's, age-related diseases, and also their length of life was longer. And when they did this study, they found the number one predictor of their health was having healthy levels of C15. They then continued on a 20-year research journey, really understanding this on a deep level and how it impacts human cells as well. And it's in the exact same way. And what I think is fascinating is one of the natural ways that you can get C15 is through whole fats and whole milks. And so many people are vegan nowadays, or we're not getting that fat or milk from cows that are grazing grass. They're grazing corn. And when that happens, we don't get the high levels of C15, which is why I think so many people are deficient without even noticing it. Now, I started taking this about 2 months ago, and immediately within the first 3 days, I noticed a difference in my digestion, in my mental clarity, in my anxiety, and in my sleep. It impacts you in a whole myriad of different ways, but it helps support the cells. It's like if you were missing one vital nutrient and then you started getting it again, your whole system starts working better. So if you guys are interested in testing out C15 for yourself, you can get 15% off their 90-day subscription starter kit by going to fatty15.com/TBM or using code TBM at checkout for 15% off. Fatty 15 is on a mission to replenish your C15 levels and restore your long-term health. For children of narcissists, how difficult that must be to feel responsible for filling that well. And I think when it comes to, let's say, an adult relationship with a parent, how do you set boundaries? How do you take space? How do you validate your own needs without feeling like it's hurting or harming the other person? Because I think that's a huge one when people take space or they want to do something different, or they know that they can't spend all of their holidays around their family. They actually can only spend one day, and then the rest they need to do something for themselves. I can see how that now adult child might say to themselves, oh no, but like they're going to be so sad. Is that my fault? And what do I do about that? Will they hate me? Will I no longer have a relationship with them? We so look to our parental figures, our caretakers, to just see us in the world and have a connection. And so when we're the ones creating that disconnect, it's almost like they have blinders on, that they can't even see how their behavior impacts why space is needed to be taken. What do you recommend there?
That is a huge part of treatment right there. What you just named is this sense of guilt. And I would call it like toxic guilt, really, because it's not, taking space for yourself and limiting the time that you spend with your narcissistic parent. All of that is very healthy and very, quote, normal behavior, right? There's nothing egregious about that. And toxic guilt really has no resolution. It's like, I feel bad. And if I always kind of ask people this, like, would that guilt resolve if you were to spend more time with them? And would it resolve in a way where you feel good and you feel like you're in your authentic self? And usually the answer is no. No, I wouldn't feel good if I resolved that guilt. I would actually just feel worse because now I'm spending more time with this person and I don't want to. So I think the first part is recognizing that toxic guilt is the legacy of growing up with a narcissistic parent, of believing you're responsible for something that you're not. This can sometimes maybe sound a little harsh at first, but if a narcissistic parent might be sad, that's a place where we get to look at, like, how is that to actually allow someone to be sad and not take responsibility for it? And I think that's just like such a new concept for people. What? I could just like let someone be sad? That feels so kind of mean. But we're not talking about being mean to someone when they're sad. It's just letting them have their own emotional experience without attaching our own need to, quote, fix it or change it or feel responsible for it. And narcissistic parents will make you feel responsible for it. That's just what they're going to do. And I think there is something to be said about when you can really see that mechanism happening, you realize that it's coming from a very dysregulated part within themselves. It really isn't about you doing something wrong. It's that they don't get the narcissistic supply that they need when you pull away, when you have boundaries, and that can feel threatening to them. So I think that's one kind of central focus, is really getting clear on When is something healthy guilt? Like, for instance, like if I don't call a friend on their birthday and they're sad and I feel bad, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry. That was not what I meant to do. And I make it up to that person. They feel better. I feel better. We're good. With toxic guilt, there really isn't that reparative process. It's more like a subjugation of your sense of self. Like, I have to go now serve my parent and make them happy until they sort of, release me from that duty. So it's a very kind of different dynamic.
Yeah. In that guilt framework, it's almost like I cannot honor my needs while also honoring, like both of our needs cannot be met in this dynamic. Either I compromise mine for you or you're unhappy and I get my needs met.
100%. Yes. And then you were touching on like boundaries. I mean, one way I think of boundaries is they're not always about asking the other person to change. That can be part of a boundary setting. But the way I think about it with adult children of narcissists, it's the ways in which you are going to take care of yourself and meet your needs and put limitations around your own energy. Sometimes framing it as like, my boundaries aren't about punishing the narcissist or punishing anyone. They're really the tools that I use to meet my own needs and allow myself to be a separate person. Adult children of narcissists have learned to be the extension of their parent. It's almost like they weren't allowed to be a separate self with needs and feelings and desires and wants. And so boundaries are a great way to remind us that we are separate and we do have limitations, and that's perfectly okay. It's necessary to protect ourselves. I always think of like the skin. Our skin is the ultimate boundary, right? It's like literally protecting our inner organs and our body. Our boundaries are that. They're protective. They're not punitive. They protect us and they help us meet our needs and allow us to take care of our emotional, physical, all the needs that we have.
One thing we were talking about before we recorded is almost like these traps or these baits that narcissistic set to kind of get that narcissistic supply. And if you could touch on what that is too. But I think about my interactions that I've had with people like that, and it's almost like you're trying to set boundaries with someone who you think is operating the same as you. And you run into a wall, they, will explain how that's selfish or being too sensitive. You have this all wrong. Gaslighting comes out. There's all these tactics, and then you start second guessing yourself. But I think understanding what are their limitations and where you're setting that boundary. You had the best post on it. I'm going to have to link your entire all of your posts. I love it. So good. But I think that clarified I have historically tried to set boundaries with this personality type in not the wrong way, but extensively an ineffective way, in a way that they would never be able to understand nor meet that. So how can you kind of break that down a little bit?
Well, the first part, narcissistic supply is any kind of reaction from another person that fuels their self-esteem, that gives them admiration, validation. I mean, even guilt tripping someone where the person might say something like, no, I didn't mean that. No, I really do think this about you. It's just another way of getting that supply. This might sound sort of like a funny way of putting it, but narcissists are kind of vampiric in a way, right? They will feed off of another person's life force to sustain themselves. So when I think of narcissistic supply, I kind of think of it in terms of a vampire, right? I need to suck your blood to stay alive. In this case, it's I need to get a reaction from you so that my false sense of self can remain intact and I don't have to feel all those uncomfortable feelings that I avoid. So that's kind of the first part of narcissistic supply. When we're setting boundaries, we often think we're setting them with someone who kind of would see it the way we see it, but narcissists don't. There is always going to be some kind of retaliatory comeback. So if you were to set a boundary, they could say, oh, is that something your therapist taught you? Really just trying to find something to use to devalue you. With narcissistic folks, we do have to change our expectations of them. They are not going to be the type of people who can go, oh, thanks for telling me. Yep, not a problem. I will honor that boundary, right? That's just not who they are. Boundaries are huge threats to them because, again, it's that cutting off narcissistic supply. So I think one thing to be aware of is when you're setting a boundary, to make sure that you are making it very clear in yourself, what is the need that I am meeting? And I always think our needs need to be non-negotiable. I am not going to sacrifice my need for independence in this way. I am going to meet that need, and here's what I'm going to do. So really keeping the boundary setting very simple and to the point. I think one trap narcissists try to pull you into is to get you to justify and explain yourself. And if that's happening, just come back to what the boundary is and stick to it. I think of like internal and interpersonal boundaries. Like there's the interpersonal boundary of, I'm not going to engage with you if you start name calling. And so if you want to continue this conversation, I would ask you to stop using that word with me. That's kind of like an interpersonal boundary. And then an internal boundary is sort of like the standards we set for ourselves. I'm not going to take phone calls after 8 p.m. My internal boundary is like, I need to get my rest, and phone calls after 8 p.m. just sort of disrupt that. So thinking of it in those terms, like what's the interpersonal boundary and what's the internal boundary, and just continuing to come back to this concept of I am going to meet my needs. And it doesn't mean you have to be rigid. Sometimes there's room for compromise if you're working with someone, if the narcissist in your life maybe is more on the mild side, on the less severe side. But at the end of the day, we want to make it really clear what our intentions are and how we're going to meet our needs, and really do our best to not get into any kind of justification, explanation traps, because they're going to want to put you in that place, which is where they can undermine your boundaries altogether. And you might even go like, well, screw it, this isn't even worth having. So just holding those principles in mind is super key.
Talk about the gray rocking method. What is that, and how can that help you navigate when you are interacting with the narcissist in your life?
Yeah, gray rocking is a term in which you essentially become as boring as a gray rock to a narcissist, because going back to narcissistic supply, they want your buy-in to their story. They want a reaction out of you. And when you can respond in a gray rocking fashion, that cuts them off from being able to get anything from you. So responding with like one word, it's like, yeah, okay. Basically not giving them anything to work with. There is another term called yellow rocking, in which maybe you don't go, no, yes, okay, right? That maybe doesn't feel quite authentic to you. You can still bring a level of warmth to your interactions and still maintain this simple, I'm not going to give you a lot of information, a lot of reaction responses. So maybe it would look like, oh, okay, cool. Right? As opposed to just like, okay. So there's a little gradation there. I think gray rocking is a great tool to use when you have to engage with a narcissist for a long period of time, or even if you have to just talk to them briefly. Honestly, it can be used in any sort of context. So that's another tool to use to just protect yourself from being mined for supply and reaction. And it just closes you off from that, really.
I think too about, especially children of narcissists are so maybe attuned or hyper aware of any sort of like selfish behavior or putting their needs first or caretaking themselves. And I think there's also just a fear of like not wanting to be their parent. What are some signs, especially if you grew up around a narcissist, you're going to be so hyper aware of certain of those behaviors. I feel like that's one of the first things a lot of people of children of narcissists ask is like, wait, am I one too? I want to set boundaries. Does that mean I'm selfish? What are some ways of dealing with that fear of being too selfish and almost overcorrecting by lack of boundaries, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a very common question, right? Am I becoming a narcissist by setting boundaries, by saying no to people, by limiting my interactions? I always come back to, first and foremost, a narcissist is not wondering if they're a narcissist, right? So you can always come back to that piece. No narcissistic person is going like, am I a narcissist? And then caring about the answer. If they ever do ask themselves that question, they might go, I probably am, but who cares? I think that's a first piece, is like a narcissist is not concerned about being a narcissist. this notion of like, is it selfish to set boundaries? I always flip it to, is this act self-caring? Because selfish always implies that we're, again, doing what a narcissist does, meeting our needs at someone else's expense, versus self-caring is recognizing that I am a separate person and I have needs and energy levels that have to be maintained and preferences. And I'm always kind of struck because folks who are concerned that they're being selfish actually wouldn't say that someone else, like a friend of theirs who was setting a boundary, was being selfish. They would actually see that as, oh no, they're taking care of themselves. So I think one way to frame it is to sort of ask yourself, would I hold that same standard to anyone else in my life? If my child wanted to set a boundary, would I think, oh my God, they're being selfish? Most people say no. Most people can go, no, I recognize that that's a really healthy thing for them to do. So the first part is remembering narcissists don't really care that they're narcissists, and setting boundaries is self-caring. It's part of how we move through the world. Sometimes this does come down to doing a little like exposure work. What happens if I set a boundary? Does my relationship with my friend completely disintegrate? Usually the answer is no. The other person is happy to know where we stand and what we need and wants to largely support us in our boundaries. And so I think being able to safely sort of explore that and see what happens when I actually set a boundary can be really eye-opening. That thing didn't happen. I didn't just like turn into a selfish narcissist. Oh, I'm actually more available, more attentive to other people now that I've had this boundary met inside of me. So there's a lot of layers to kind of work through in that, but ultimately framing it as a self-caring practice, I think, can be really helpful.
What about some of the internalized beliefs and the fears of stepping outside of those beliefs? I have one friend who every time that they had any sort of success, whether it was career or relationship or anything in their life, immediately it became shut down, minimized, taken away from them in a certain sense, And so now I see the pattern play out with them where they're really, really afraid to win. They're afraid to shine. They're afraid to put themselves out there out of fear of that getting batted down again or taken from them in some regard. What advice would you give for someone who's really struggling to feel safe, to follow their authentic desires, their needs, to identify who they even are authentically without shutting it out with the voice of that narcissist in their head too?
You're totally spot on that there is this like internalized fear around success, because usually the narcissistic person sees their success as a threat to them. So they might undermine it, dismiss it, may even kind of imply that the relationship is going to go away, that kind of fear of abandonment. It's funny. I keep wanting to say like with TBM, we're like reprogramming those beliefs. There is a lot of that. There's a lot of going into what is the mental story here? What does my mind say is going to happen if I experience this success? And is that true? Can I know that to be true? My mentor has this great analogy that shame and these limiting beliefs are kind of like a parasitic vine wrapping around an otherwise healthy tree trunk. It's like the tree trunk is separate from these vines. And what these vines do is they start to sort of suck the life out of the tree trunk. And I think being able to see these beliefs as not me, those are not really my authentic beliefs. These are the beliefs I took in from a parasitic, toxic person. And I'm now believing them to be my own. And so I think we have to kind of start seeing them as things that we've internalized from our parents and that no longer apply to us in the here and now. I really value a lot of like emotion-focused somatic work. So you were talking about how to feel safe. What can kind of happen is when the body doesn't feel safe, it can feel like out there is the thing that's not safe. When in reality, something is happening internally. Our nervous system is being activated by a perception of threat. And that is what's making us feel unsafe. So it's not necessarily that success is unsafe. It's how my nervous system has oriented to what success means. Success to this person, success might mean a significant loss. So I think part of that is also being able to help the nervous system ground into the present moment and find that regulation to feel more safe so that you can then more clearly access the beliefs that are coming up for you and really evaluate them. Is that true? Is there another way I could perceive this? Would I say that about someone else who is having fears around success? Or how would I work with them through that? I mean, sometimes just even that question can jolt you out of that hypnotic state of I'm going to fail or everything is bad. And you can go, oh, no, I don't hold that same belief for that person over there. So if I can work with that person, or if I can have a different belief system for that person over there, I can turn that around and apply it to myself. And so it is building this relationship to self where you can tune in and notice, where am I not feeling safe? What's the kind of mental story that's coming up for me? And this other piece of how might I compassionately hold myself through this experience in a way that would allow me to pursue what I'm pursuing? There's so many different layers that are happening in that place, but that's why I really love the TBM work, is because you do get to get into close proximity to these beliefs you've had on for yourself for so long and really see where they come from and unlearn them, reprogram them.
Yeah, I was even thinking about in our deep imaginings, we have a validation one where it's basically like, what is that experience? Validate it being true. And I think for anyone struggling with any of this stuff, especially even after you have an interaction with a narcissist, and then you start to question like, wait, they said that, did they mean this? Is that they're saying I'm not good enough at this, or whatever the story is, validate that that was a really triggering interaction. And the other DI that comes to mind too, when you were saying that, is our worst case scenario one, where it basically walks you through how to face that fear. And then, okay, if you hit that fear, how could you cope? Let's say they did say something about your success, or they did try to tear you down or whatever. Great. What's the support systems you have now, today, as an adult that you didn't have as a kid?
I think that is such an important piece, is like learning to recognize that those fears are coming from a very vulnerable child part of ourselves and eliciting the adult self. We kind of need our adult self to come in and help us work through those triggers. And yes, validating your experience is so crucial, of being able to say, yeah, that really hurt. Of course, that was a trigger. Naturally, you're afraid of this. To really contextualize that this didn't just come out of nowhere, right? You were conditioned to feel these things. And the worst case scenario component is so liberating, really, when you get to get right to the fear, right down to the core, and then go, okay, and then what would I do? How would I manage this? And sometimes you get to see, it's not so much that it's not as scary as you thought it was, but it's, you didn't realize you had all of these coping strategies available at the time. And then the fear kind of just shrinks down a little bit because your sense of coping and resources and inner validation just gets a lot higher.
I think too, when people do reparenting work and inner child work, they think they need to envision the parents that they had giving them the behavior that they want. And I think that can be really, really challenging for a lot of people. I don't know what you recommend, but I always tell people, envision your higher self, or if you were the parent to you, how would you show up? Because sometimes if you use the exact parent, you cannot cognitively get what you want from that parent. So just give yourself a new parent.
Yeah. And I'm personally very much attracted to the, like, what would your highest self, your most compassionate self, how would that part of you hold that child's experience? And it's way more simple than we give it credit. We don't need to have really big displays of anything. Usually it just looks like validating, soothing, getting curious. What are you feeling? Helping that part face whatever they're afraid of in a very co-regulated, safe way. Sure, you could envision like ideal parents that weren't yours. Maybe they're your neighbors, maybe they're your grandparents, maybe they're just made up concepts in your mind. But I think it really goes to show we can access a part of ourselves that is deeply caring and compassionate and can walk us through our fears in ways we really weren't supported as children.
You shared a tool on our initial call when someone is being passive aggressive or sharing those little digs that maybe you don't register as a dig right away, but you know what they were trying to get you to feel in that environment. What tools do you have for that?
Yeah, I think we were talking about like how narcissists project, and they can project things like, oh, well, you're just a really needy person. God, you're so dramatic with these big feelings. When that's happening, when you're with a narcissist and they're using you language, you do this, you do that, they're really revealing what they do, what they feel, and have not integrated into themselves. So one mental trick that I'll use is if someone is doing that to me, I go like, oh, this doesn't feel good. I think this is something that they're revealing about themselves. And so I'll kind of mentally flip it. Instead of like, you're so needy, I would imagine them saying, I'm afraid of my own needs. Or your feelings are so big and dramatic, I'm afraid of my big dramatic feelings. They don't feel safe. And so being able to do that internally allows you not to internalize it. And you can see it for what it is. This is a person who can't regulate through their own feelings, and so has to use me as a tool, as a dumping ground even, to put all of their vulnerable feelings onto. And if you don't see it, what can end up happening is you start to identify with it. Yeah, maybe my needs are too much. Maybe my feelings are too big. And that becomes really part of the cycle of narcissistic abuse. But if you can start to see it as, no, this person is using me to regulate themselves, it just starts to kind of create this natural distance between you and them and what they're trying to do to you, so that when you see it, it naturally creates distance. If I'm holding it in my hand, oh, this is just a thing. It's not me. It's separate from me. So it's just like a way of really getting clear in yourself. Like, they're not actually revealing anything about me. They're revealing a ton about themselves.
I had an example from someone submitted in that the narcissist in their life basically was making fun of a physical attribute of their new friend. And immediately they were like, why would you say that? That's so rude. And the narcissist sort of replied like, oh no, I'm just observing. That's a fact. I'm just witnessing what I see on them. It's not a rude statement. So infuriating to navigate that. How would you respond? How do you respond? Is that a situation for gray rocking? Like when someone is basically saying something rude, and then when you say that was a rude comment, they respond with, that wasn't rude. It's just a fact. Or this is, that sort of behavior.
Yes. Oh man. It's almost like tendrils of gaslighting, right? Like, no, I didn't say that. That's not rude. What are you talking about? I mean, on the one hand, I think being able to, from that point, perhaps then set a boundary. Well, I would prefer it if you did not talk about this person's physical attributes. Getting away from, yes, it is rude, because they're just going to come back with, no, it's not. And just laying down that boundary. Well, I would prefer this moving forward. And of course, they may come at you with like, wow, you're so sensitive or something. At that point, yeah, gray rocking is a great, great tool. Anything that helps you to disengage from this back and forth with them is going to be paramount, because what they're doing is just, again, getting more of that narcissistic supply, right? Now you're having a reaction to what they're saying. And so it's not about like just being passive in the face of that, but it can look like really making a clear declaration of a boundary and sticking to it, and then just not engaging further with them if you can. And it is something that they're going to absolutely use against you. You're just being sensitive. I'm just speaking truth. Oh, what am I not allowed to speak my opinion here? And that's when you really practice not getting into the content, into what they're saying, but really staying clear in the process. This person is treating me and my friend in this way, and I'm going to set that boundary. I'm not going to get into the content of, is it rude? Is it not? This just sort of like creates more fuel for them to get from you.
Yeah, you can see how it's provoking on purpose. And
Yes.
if you can take a pause and notice, okay, they're actively trying to provoke me. And if I engage back or really defend myself, if I get on the defensive, then that is giving them exactly what they're looking for, instead of saying like, we can separate it, pause it here.
Exactly. Yes. Disengaging, asserting your boundaries, validating your own feelings and your needs, and then working towards separating from engagement with them on any level.
By now, you're starting to get the feel for TBM. Maybe you've heard about our workshops and you're interested in manifestation, but you just don't have the time or energy to sit down and do self-help work. We totally get it. In fact, that's why we created the Daily Practice, which is our massive library of self-hypnosis tracks that you can do anytime without having to jump into a workshop. We call these tracks our deep imaginings, or DIs. DIs are different than normal meditations because we designed them using a combination of self-hypnosis techniques, deep theta waves, EMDR-informed tools, and somatic experiencing. A fully loaded formula that is scientifically proven to help you clear your blocks and triggers on a subconscious level, giving you the power to actually create new neural pathways in your brain. So if your boss pisses you off, use our trigger DI. If you want to feel magnetic before a party or an important meeting, use the magnetic self DI. If you're feeling anxious or down on yourself or you need help making a decision, we've got a DI for all of these scenarios and more. You can get full access to the Daily Practice inside the Pathway membership, where you'll also get unlimited access to every workshop, tool, and offering from TBM. The tools in the Pathway membership will support you year-round, whether you're in the worst, a rock bottom, or second worst, a rut, or feeling good and you want to keep the magnetism going. In the Pathway, you'll effectively learn how to become your own manifestation coach, all for less than $1 a day. So even if you're not ready to start a workshop, join the Pathway and start rewriting your neural pathways now to create magnetism. Work through your triggers and get closer to your authentic magnetic self in order to manifest. Use our special code MAGNETIC, all caps, MAGNETIC, to receive $20 off your first TBM purchase. Again, that's all caps, magnetic. Now back to the episode.
What about people who, we had a lot of people kind of speak to feeling like they don't know who their authentic self is. A lot of self-identity issues after growing up with a parent on the narcissistic spectrum. And really what that does for trying to understand, like they might think they're this, but then they're not, it's a very confusing landscape to actually validate, no, I genuinely, authentically like this, or I really enjoy this aspect, or I want to go in this direction. How can people start to pick that apart or even just validate the things that feel like them or register, oh no, that is the true me?
I always like to come back to the body. How does that feel in your body when you're doing XYZ? If you're feeling called to paint, when you're doing that, do you feel a sense of settled quality, like calm, openness? I always feel like the authentic self is really at the core, like it's just like love, being in this conscious, loving, receptive place. And anything that makes you feel, well, shitty, bad, is not your authentic self. That's not you. And so I always feel like using the body as a way to tune in. What is this action that I'm taking? How does it feel somatically? That can be a really great tool to tune in if that's maybe part of your authenticity. Sometimes it is just about trying out new things. How do you feel when you join a book club? What's that experience like? And I think there's so much mining that we can do when it comes to building our authentic sense of self. Community is a great place to kind of feel that out, getting to know other people, having shared interests, essentially anything that fortifies feelings inside of you that feel good, that feel open, that feel safe, are largely tied to your authentic self. A lot of my clients and a lot of people with narcissistic parents struggle with the two things I think I was mentioning, feeling their emotions and honoring their needs. And I feel like the more we can help yourself validate, normalize, feel your feelings, and the more you can normalize, validate, and meet your needs, the clearer that authentic self starts to become. It's like literally taking shape in front of you for the first time, when you can allow those two parts of your personality, your identity, to be fully met and witnessed and seen and felt and all those things.
One thing that's popping to mind is also healthy anger, because that's, I think, a big struggle is people see anger as something that, honestly, I've seen people, they don't allow themselves to process healthy anger, and then they turn the healthy anger into like internally. And so then it becomes a really critical self-narrative instead. So what would you say for someone who's starting to get comfortable with their healthy anger?
On the one hand, I think of healthy anger, you named it beautifully. It is our way of feeling into our own personal power. It is a powerful feeling. It allows us to take up space. It allows us to stop harmful behavior. It's really like the ultimate self-loving emotion, right? Because there is a self we are trying to protect with our healthy anger. For those who struggle to feel that, you're right. They're going to naturally start to put the onus on themselves. Oh, well, maybe I'm angry with you, but no, it's just because I have too high of a standard. There's something, I'm too critical, whatever. It's a way of cutting off their own power from themselves. And so as a person starting to feel into their own healthy anger, they might notice themselves feeling a lot more confident, actually, because anger is very mobilizing. It helps us meet our needs. It unfortunately has a bad rap. We think of anger as sort of equating it to like being violent, when in reality, it is just energy inside of the body that helps us mobilize in a certain way that meets our needs, that, it's very justice oriented as well. So it's a wonderful emotion to be able to befriend and feel into your body. And so I think someone who's finally at that point where they're able to feel their feeling of anger towards someone has really had a breakthrough, because it's literally defying all this conditioning they've had around keeping your angry feelings to yourself, because a narcissistic parent would not be able to tolerate their children's healthy anger. That's why I think a lot of people who've been raised by narcissists struggle so much with anger and do end up struggling with depression and anxiety. These are the feelings that come when our primary feelings, our primary emotions can't be expressed or attuned to.
And what would be an example of like how to move through healthy anger versus how externally and societally we see anger as yelling or getting combative or loud or a very dysregulated state of anger? What would be any healthy practices to allow anger to show up, to validate it and move through it on your own without it projecting out to others?
Oh, yes. Again, always coming back to the body. I think if you can, to pause and tune in. How does this anger feel in my body? And sometimes just tuning into how it feels, how it's moving, can give you a lot of space, actually. I think there's this common expression that emotions only last really for about 90 seconds. And what makes them last longer is when we start getting into the story around it. That can start to exaggerate it and make it bigger. So I think the first step is to really register, what does it feel like in your body? What does it feel like doing? How does it want to move? Sometimes I'll even have clients give it a voice. If it had anything it wanted to say, what is it wanting to say on your behalf? And then I think another piece is really registering that when anger is present, that usually means that a need is not being met. Maybe we're not being heard by a person in our life. Maybe our need for autonomy is being thwarted or interfered with. And so after you've really felt it in your body, I think the next step is getting clear on what is the need here and what need is my anger helping me meet right now. So I think that's one way of just taking real accountability for your feelings and not defaulting to the being explosive and projecting it outward. Someone who falls into that is in a dysregulated place. It's they're not even really angry. They're just dysregulated. They're disconnected from themselves. And so the first step is to regulate, connect, feel the emotion somatically, and then tune into what is the need and how can I meet it in a way that's honorable to me and perhaps the other person if it's an interpersonal need.
Are there any mantras or like empowering beliefs, or we call them like our magnetic beliefs, that you think are vital specifically to people who are in recovery from narcissistic abuse of any sort?
I mean, I think the first couple that come to my mind is like, it is safe for me to meet my needs. All of my feelings are valid as they are. This one's a harder one. I always put it out there, and I think sometimes in the beginning, it doesn't always feel like you can connect to it, which is like, I am enough exactly as I am. But I do think the more you can say that to yourself, the more true it starts to feel. I think folks who are in the beginning of recovery are like, what? That sounds like I can't ever grasp onto that. But if that doesn't resonate yet, you can always say, I am working on believing that I am enough exactly as I am. It's almost kind of like the way you would talk to a little kid if they were having a difficult time. It's okay that you're crying. Your feelings are natural. I'm always going to be there for you. And I think when we can say that to ourselves, that can also feel really, really empowering, because we're developing that safe, connected relationship to ourselves and really the part of ourselves that can hold our experiences in their entirety.
Okay, so Hannah, where can everyone find you, connect with you, work with you, all of the things?
So right now, you can find me on Instagram at Already Good Enough. I'm going to be coming out with some online courses. I'm also going to be opening up coaching at some point, so just stay tuned for that. I am a licensed therapist, so if you happen to be a Washington State resident, you can find me at heartfeltonlinetherapy.com. I'll soon be working with folks in California, so those are the two places right now that you can find me. I've got a Substack. You can see that on Instagram. It's all in the links and stuff. So yeah.
And we'll link everything in the show notes too.
Right on.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This was so helpful and informative, and just helping everyone get back to their whole, authentic, worthy selves.
Thank you so, so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
I hope you all enjoyed that episode as much as we did. And if you're starting to get a feel for this to be magnetic manifestation process, but aren't completely sold yet, let me point you to some of our free offerings. You can check out the expanded podcast episode called How to Manifest Anything You Desire, where Lacey, the founder, and I break down exactly what this process is all about. You can check out The Motivation, which is our testimonial library with thousands of testimonials of people who have manifested wild things using this process. Or you can check out our free mini workshop to find out why you're not manifesting, and listen to one of our proprietary deep imagining audios, where it's going to help you drop into your theta state and overwrite low self-worth limiting beliefs. Enjoy. We'll see you next week.